It was 2 a.m., and Marcus had just made a mistake that could cost him his job. He was exhausted, working a 16-hour shift just to support his son. In that empty parking lot, with no cameras pointed at the panel, he had two choices: walk away and pretend nothing happened, or admit the mistake and risk being fired. He chose the second option, but what he didn't know was that in the shadows of that empty building, the billionaire owner was standing there, watching his every move. Her reaction the next morning:
Many would have walked away, Marcus. But your honesty just saved more than your job.
was not what anyone expected. If you believe fatherhood is proven in the moments no one is supposed to see, this story is for you. This is where quiet choices define a man and change a family's future. Subscribe to The Father's Journey for stories of single fathers whose integrity rewrote their lives. The air in the maintenance locker room smelled of industrial soap and damp concrete, a scent that seemed to cling to Marcus as tightly as his faded navy coveralls. It was 5 in the morning, the hour when the world felt suspended in a gray, quiet haze. He checked the small, cracked screen of his phone, noting a text from the neighbor confirming his son was still asleep. At 41, Marcus felt the weight of every year in his lower back, a constant reminder of shifts that bled into one another until time lost its shape. He adjusted the strap of his heavy tool bag, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders that came from carrying more than just wrenches and screwdrivers. Home was a cramped apartment in a corner of Cleveland where the streetlights flickered with an unpredictable rhythm. 6 years had passed since the house felt full, since the laughter of his wife had provided a buffer against the harsh edges of reality. Now, the silence was broken only by the hum of an aging refrigerator and the soft breathing of 9-year-old Elijah. Marcus moved through the small kitchen, preparing a simple breakfast with practiced, mechanical efficiency. He placed a glass of water on the table, making sure the coaster was perfectly centered, a small gesture of order in a life that often felt like it was fraying at the seams. He walked to the doorway of Elijah's room, watching the boy's chest rise and fall. The child was growing faster than Marcus could afford to buy new clothes, his ankles often peeking out from beneath the hems of his trousers. Marcus felt a sharp pang of inadequacy, a cold realization that his best efforts barely kept him afloat. He was a man who had once managed entire production lines, but now he was someone people looked past in hallways, a ghost in a uniform. The world saw a technician. Elijah saw a hero who was always tired. The rent increase notice sat on the counter, a stark white rectangle that felt heavier than his entire toolbox. He picked it up, knowing the numbers didn't add up no matter how many times he did the math. He tucked it into a drawer, hiding the stress behind a mask of calm. He had to be the anchor, the steady hand, even when his own heart felt like it was drifting in a storm he couldn't control. The corporate complex loomed in the city center like a monolith of glass and steel, catching the urban lights with a metallic coldness. Marcus arrived at the underground parking garage shortly before midnight, his eyes burning after a day that felt like it had no end. The emergency call promised a double-rate fee, the kind of supplement that could mean a new pair of shoes for Elijah or simply 1 week without the usual tightening in his chest. The silence of the basement was broken only by the distant drip of a pipe and the sound of his own footsteps echoing against the smooth concrete. He opened the secondary panel, a complex tangle of fiber optics and circuit breakers that controlled the technological pulse of the building. His fingers, though rough and calloused, moved with a necessary delicacy, adjusting connections that looked like the veins of a dormant organism. Fatigue, however, acted like an invisible veil over his senses. In an almost imperceptible movement, he reconfigured a redundancy module, feeling the metallic click that indicated the fit. The system accepted the command, the status lights glowing a reassuring green, but a chill ran down his spine the moment he closed the metal cover, knowing the alignment was slightly off. A small detail, a misalignment in the logic of the subsystem, throbbed in his mind. It was not an error that would cause an immediate short circuit or trigger alarms. It was something silent, a latent flaw that would wait for the peak processing hour on Monday morning to manifest, likely crashing the data network for hundreds of offices. Marcus looked at his watch. It was nearly 2 in the morning. He thought of his empty bed, the long drive back to his neighborhood, and the desperate need to close this work order to trigger the payment. No one was there to supervise. The security cameras pointed toward the entrances, not the technical guts of the building. He took 2 steps toward the exit, feeling the weight of the keys in his pocket, knowing he could simply walk away. The error would be blamed on an external surge or a software glitch, anything that wouldn't carry his name. But the image of Elijah asking if honesty mattered, when no one was looking, surfaced with sharp clarity. Marcus stopped in front of the elevator, feeling the cold air conditioning against his damp skin, aware that the silence of the garage was the only judge of his integrity. Marcus turned back toward the panel, his boots sounding heavy and deliberate against the concrete. He reopened the metal casing, the sharp scent of ozone meeting him as he began the painstaking process of undoing his own work. His hands shook slightly from exhaustion, but he forced them into stillness, knowing that a single slip now could turn a controlled correction into a genuine disaster. He spent another hour tracing wires and recalibrating the logic board, meticulously ensuring that every connection was seated with absolute precision. The physical fatigue was a dull roar in his ears, yet he felt a strange, quiet clarity settling over him as he finished. Once the panel was secured for the second time, Marcus pulled a crumpled notebook from his pocket. He didn't just leave a standard digital log. He wrote a manual report in his steady, blocky handwriting, detailing the exact nature of his initial mistake. He described the potential for a subsystem collapse on Monday morning and clearly stated that the error had been his own. He signed his full name at the bottom, knowing that this piece of paper was essentially a confession that could end his relationship with the contracting agency. He tucked the report into the plastic sleeve on the door of the panel, smoothed it out, and finally walked away. High above the garage, in a darkened security suite, Evelyn Hartman watched the grainy feed on a wall of monitors. She had stayed late to review the structural integrity reports of her newest acquisition, and the movement in the basement had caught her eye. She saw the man in the navy coveralls stop, hesitate at the elevator, and then return to the work site with a look of grim determination. She watched him work for an hour, noticing how he wiped his forehead with his sleeve, but never rushed. When he finally left the handwritten note, she leaned forward, her interest piqued by a display of accountability she rarely saw in the boardroom. Marcus drove home as the first hints of dawn began to bleed into the Cleveland skyline. He felt a hollow sensation in his stomach, the kind that comes from knowing you have done the right thing at the cost of your own security. When he let himself into the apartment, he found Elijah asleep on the sofa, a book about space exploration resting on his chest. Marcus gently moved the book, noticing a drawing his son had tucked inside, a picture of 2 figures walking, labeled Dad and Me. He sat on the edge of the couch, watching the boy sleep, knowing that by Monday, his name would be a liability, but his conscience would be clear. The following Monday, the storm Marcus had anticipated arrived with a clinical, cold efficiency. His phone rang at 8 in the morning, the caller ID displaying the name of his supervisor at the maintenance agency. The voice on the other end was frantic, explaining that the Hartman Group had flagged a manual report in the main server hub. The supervisor didn't ask for a technical explanation. He asked why Marcus had been foolish enough to document a mistake that no one would have otherwise found. There was a heavy silence on the line when Marcus replied that the truth was the only way to ensure the system didn't fail during peak hours. By midday, Marcus was informed that his scheduled shifts for the rest of the week had been reassigned to other technicians. The agency viewed his honesty as a complication, a variable that made clients uneasy. He sat at his kitchen table, the wood scarred by years of use, staring at his toolbox resting by the door. He felt the familiar weight of being a man who followed the rules in a world that preferred convenience. When he picked Elijah up from school, he had to force a smile, tucking the worry deep into his pockets so the boy wouldn't see the fear of the coming month's bills. The reversal came on Wednesday, not through a termination letter, but in the form of a black sedan idling in front of his apartment building. A woman in a tailored suit, whose presence felt like a sharp contrast to the peeling paint of the hallway, handed him a business card with a gold-embossed crest. She told him that Evelyn Hartman requested his presence at the headquarters, not as a contractor, but as a guest. Marcus looked down at his clean but frayed shirt, feeling the sting of being judged for his appearance even as he was being summoned by power. He realized he was being called to account for his character, a prospect that felt more daunting than any technical failure. He entered the Hartman boardroom an hour later, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view of the city that seemed designed to make people feel small. Evelyn sat at the head of a long mahogany table. The handwritten report Marcus had left in the garage, sitting before her like a piece of evidence. She didn't look angry. She looked curious, her sharp eyes scanning him as if he were a blueprint she was trying to decode. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the judgment of a woman who had spent a lifetime watching people hide their flaws to protect their status. Marcus stood his ground, his hands folded in front of him, knowing that his integrity was the only thing he had left to lose. Evelyn gestured toward the seat across from her, her movements fluid and devoid of the practiced aggression Marcus expected from someone of her stature. She didn't lead with questions about the technicalities of the panel or the cost of the delay. Instead, she asked him why he chose to return to the basement when the elevator doors were already open. Marcus looked at the handwritten note on the table, seeing his own rough script under the soft glow of the recessed lighting. He spoke about the weight of a quiet house and the eyes of a son who looked at him as if he were the compass for the rest of his life. The air in the room seemed to shift as Marcus explained that a mistake hidden is a debt that grows interest. He realized then that Evelyn wasn't looking for a technician to scold. She was looking for a person who hadn't been hollowed out by the corporate habit of self-preservation. She revealed, in a voice that momentarily lost its iron edge, that her own son had died because a safety inspector had once decided that a minor deviation wasn't worth the paperwork of a report. The silence that followed was heavy, a shared recognition of the invisible threads that connect a single choice to a distant consequence. Despite the connection, there was no immediate offer of a grand promotion or a life of ease. Evelyn explained that in her world, trust was earned in increments, not granted in a single moment of theater. She offered him a temporary contract within her internal audit team, a position that required him to find the very mistakes others were paid to overlook. The salary was enough to cover the rent and Elijah's school fees, but it came with the reality that he would be an outsider among professionals who valued their polished surfaces. Marcus accepted, knowing that he was trading his social invisibility for a different kind of isolation. His first weeks at the Hartman Group were spent in the shadows of vast mechanical rooms and server farms, carrying a digital tablet that felt lighter but more dangerous than his old wrench. He worked alongside engineers who wore watches that cost more than his car, men who viewed his presence as an intrusion. They spoke in a language of optimization and margins, often falling silent when Marcus entered the room to verify their data. He felt the cold friction of their resentment, a sharp reminder that status is a fortress those inside are always eager to defend. The resentment in the office was not a loud confrontation, but a series of closed doors and omitted calendar invites. Marcus spent his days in the sublevels of the Hartman headquarters, verifying blueprints against the physical reality of copper and steel. He noticed how the junior engineers would glance at his scuffed boots before looking him in the eye, their silence serving as a barrier between his practical experience and their theoretical expertise. He was a man who understood how machines breathe, yet he was treated as a ghost haunting the corridors of a high-tech future. The pressure intensified when a subtle offer arrived in the form of an unsigned envelope left on his desk. Inside was a suggestion that he could overlook the lagging response times in a minor satellite project, a move that would ensure the project leads received their quarterly bonuses. The note hinted that a cooperative attitude would lead to a more permanent, comfortable position within the company. Marcus looked at the paper, then out at the rainy Cleveland skyline, feeling the lure of an easier path. He thought of Elijah's recent struggle with his schoolwork and how that extra money could pay for a tutor who didn't look as tired as Marcus did every evening. That night, Marcus sat at the small kitchen table, the envelope tucked into his pocket like a heavy stone. Elijah was sketching in his notebook, his brow furrowed in deep concentration as he tried to get the proportions of a bridge just right. The boy looked up and asked if the people at the new job were nice to him. Marcus hesitated, the weight of the bribe pressing against his leg, before telling his son that being liked was less important than being someone who could be relied upon. The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his drawing, leaving Marcus to wrestle with the cost of his own lessons. He returned to the office the next morning and shredded the note without a word to anyone. He then filed a report that detailed the exact inconsistencies he had been asked to ignore, knowing that he was effectively burning the only bridge that offered him a shortcut to stability. The reaction from the department was immediate and freezing. His desk was moved to a smaller, windowless cubicle near the service elevator. He spent the next 3 days in near total isolation, documented every discrepancy he found, and prepared himself for the inevitable moment when the system would decide he was more trouble than he was worth. The tension reached a breaking point during the final phase of the Smart Infrastructure Project, a sprawling urban initiative that served as the crown jewel of the Hartman Group. Marcus was assigned to a routine verification of the structural sensor grid, a task his colleagues viewed as a mere formality. While tracing the data paths, he found a recurring anomaly in the stress load calculations for the central support pillars. It was a minor deviation on paper, but Marcus, who had spent years feeling the vibration of failing machinery through his own hands, knew the reading was a mask for a much deeper instability. He brought the findings to the lead engineer, a man whose career was tethered to the project's success. The response was a sharp, dismissive laugh, followed by a warning that halting the project now would cost the company millions and Marcus his career. The air in the glass-walled office felt thin, suffocating with the unspoken demand that he simply look the other way. Marcus realized that the cooperative attitude they wanted was a surrender of his own identity. He stood in the middle of the bustling floor, a man in a simple shirt, surrounded by tailored suits, and felt the absolute weight of his choice. He spent the next 12 hours buried in schematics, rechecking every line of code and every physical bolt until his eyes burned. He didn't send a polite email or a tentative suggestion. He compiled a definitive report that exposed the structural flaw and hand-delivered it to the executive board. The project was halted within the hour. The silence that followed was deafening. He was stripped of his access badges and told to wait at home until a formal review could be conducted. He walked out of the building with his toolbox, the sun setting behind the skyscrapers, feeling the familiar sting of being the one who broke the gears of a profitable machine. That evening, the apartment felt smaller than usual. Marcus sat in the dark, watching the shadows of passing cars dance across the ceiling. He felt a profound sense of failure, not because he had done wrong, but because doing right seemed to keep him in the same cycle of scarcity. Elijah came into the room, sensing the heavy atmosphere, and sat beside him on the floor. The boy talked about a school project where they had to identify a person of integrity, and he told Marcus he had written about the man who went back to the garage when no one was watching. Marcus pulled his son close, his throat tightening, realizing that while he might have lost a job, he had preserved the only legacy that truly mattered. The silence of the following week was a physical wait, a period where the telephone remained a mute witness to Marcus's anxiety. He returned to the rhythm of the neighborhood, patching a neighbor's leaky faucet and fixing a broken heater to keep the pantry stocked. Then, a courier arrived with a simple, heavy envelope. It wasn't a termination notice, but a summons to the Smart Infrastructure site. When he arrived, the bustling construction had stopped. A team of independent engineers was busy drilling core samples from the very pillars Marcus had flagged, their faces grim as they looked at the results of their tests. Evelyn Hartman stood by the perimeter fence, her coat collar turned up against the biting wind. She signaled for Marcus to join her, handing him a folder containing the new audit results. The flaw he had identified was real. Had it gone unnoticed, the structure would have faced a catastrophic failure within months of completion. She spoke quietly, noting that while the company had lost millions in delays, they had saved something far more difficult to recover. She looked at Marcus, acknowledging that his refusal to bend had protected her name and the lives of those who would eventually use the space. She didn't offer him a bonus or a public ceremony. Instead, she offered him a permanent position as the Director of Operational Integrity, a role with the authority to halt any project that didn't meet his standards. The salary was substantial, a figure that meant Elijah would never have to worry about the length of his trousers again, but the true value lay in the autonomy of the role. Marcus looked at the site, seeing the workers begin the necessary repairs, and realized that his invisibility had finally been replaced by a quiet, unshakable respect. He walked back to his old car, his hand steady on the steering wheel. For the first time in years, The tension in his shoulders felt like a memory rather than a constant companion. He thought about the cracked coaster on his kitchen table and the rent notice in the drawer, knowing those days were behind him. He wasn't a hero in a storybook. He was a father who had stood his ground, a man who had proven that the most important work is often the kind that leaves no trace except the safety of others. The transition to the new life happened without the fanfare of a celebration, manifesting instead in the quiet rhythm of a Tuesday morning. Marcus sat in his new office, a space defined by functional simplicity rather than corporate excess. On his desk sat a small framed photo of his wife and a jar of pencils Elijah had picked out. The view from the window showed the city not as a cold grid of obstacles, but as a living system that he was now responsible for protecting. He felt a profound sense of arrival, a realization that the path of most resistance had finally led to a place of standing. Evelyn entered the room unannounced, carrying a small wooden frame. Inside was the original, oil-stained manual report Marcus had written in the parking garage. She placed it on the wall near the door, a stark contrast to the digital displays and sleek architecture of the building. She told him it was there to remind everyone who entered that the foundation of the company wasn't built on steel, but on the courage of a person willing to be honest in the dark. Marcus looked at his own handwriting, seeing the traces of the man who had been terrified and exhausted, yet refused to walk away. That evening, Marcus arrived home while the sun was still high in the sky. He didn't head straight for the couch to collapse. Instead, he grabbed a baseball and a pair of gloves. He called for Elijah, and they walked to the park nearby, a space where the grass was green and the sounds of the neighborhood felt like a symphony rather than a threat. As they played, Marcus watched his son move with a new kind of lightness, a confidence that came from knowing the world was a place where effort and truth carried a tangible weight. They sat on a bench as the shadows lengthened, sharing a sandwich in a comfortable silence. Elijah looked at his father's hands, which were cleaner now, but still bore the faint scars of a decade of hard labor. The boy remarked that Marcus seemed taller lately. Marcus smiled, realizing that the height didn't come from a title or a paycheck, but from the fact that he no longer had to hide any part of his life. He had built a future for his son on a foundation of absolute truth, a structure that would outlast any building in the city. Building a legacy is about more than the work we do. It is about the man our children see when the world isn't watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Father's Journey. Share this with a dad who works hard to build a foundation of integrity for his family. Let's keep walking this path together.